November 16th, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, west of the Siegfried line. Dawn comes slow and pale over a forest that no longer breathes. The trees are broken silhouettes, trunks split open by artillery, their tops lying like fallen spears across the mud. A freezing mist clings to everything, muffling sound, turning men into shadows. A squad from the U.S. 28th Infantry Division lies motionless behind the jagged ridge of a shell crater. Their faces are streaked with grime and rain. Frost gathers on helmets. Somewhere ahead, buried into the slope, waits a German bunker. Steel doors, concrete walls 2 meters thick, and a slit no wider than a hand through which an MG-42 spits fire every few seconds. Each burst rips into the mist, cutting branches like scissors through paper. For hours, they've been pinned down. Every attempt to crawl forward has been punished. Ammunition runs low. Radios are dead. The forest smells of cordite, pine sap, and fear. But one man, a corporal from Ohio, doesn't move for cover. He's kneeling in the mud, staring at the few things left around him. A flare pistol, a length of signal wire, a dented German ration tin. While others brace for death, he begins to build an idea, one that will silence that bunker. Without a single shot, by late 1944, the war in Europe had reached a brutal, grinding phase. The Allies had landed in Normandy 5 months earlier, stormed across France, and now stood at the gates of Germany itself. Yet progress had slowed to a crawl. Between the American front lines and the open German plains stood one of the most treacherous battlegrounds of the entire war, the Hürtgen Forest. It was a region of towering pines, narrow ravines, and sodden ground, stretching for miles along the German border near Aachen. What made it deadly was not its size, but its nature. The forest swallowed sound and light, turning every skirmish into close-quarter combat. Shells detonated in the treetops, raining wood splinters sharp as razors. Maps were useless. Visibility dropped to 10 yards. Even the air seemed to weigh on men's lungs. When the U.S. First Army entered the Hürtgen in September, they expected a short fight. Perhaps 2 weeks to clear the woods. But by November, the offensive had become one of the longest and costliest battles ever fought on German soil. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall as the Germans called it, was no ordinary defense. It was a continuous chain of pillboxes, minefields, and dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles stretching from the Netherlands to Switzerland. Behind every ridge was another bunker. Behind every bunker, another line of trenches. For American infantry, this was a nightmare. The Germans, though exhausted and under constant bombardment, fought with ferocious discipline. Bunkers were arranged to create interlocking fields of fire, each one protecting the next. An assault that silenced a single machine gun often ended with another opening up moments later. It was a fortress of concrete and geometry, and the forest itself was its ally. In early November, the 28th Infantry Division, known as the Keystone Division, was ordered to break through the southern sector of the Hürtgen. Its mission was simple on paper: advance 3 miles, seize key road junctions, and prepare the way for the next offensive. But every yard cost blood. Rain turned the ground to sludge. Cold turned rifles to ice. Artillery spotters couldn't see through the canopy. American soldiers soon realized that the enemy wasn't just defending terrain. They were defending the gateway to Germany's heartland. Every hill, every pillbox was fought over as if it were Berlin itself. The 28th regiments, the 109th, 110th, and 112th, were decimated in the process. Entire companies vanished in the mist, cut off by minefields or collapsed trees. Communication broke down. Casualties mounted faster than reinforcements could arrive. Among these exhausted men were the remnants of a rifle company assigned to seize a ridge dotted with 3 German bunkers. The plan was textbook: suppressive fire from mortars, a flanking maneuver through the trees, then a direct assault using grenades and satchel charges. But the forest swallowed coordination. Mortar rounds landed short. Machine guns were positioned wrong. When the assault began, only a handful of men reached the first clearing alive. They had no radio link, no air support, and the German bunkers remained untouched. Pinned behind a ridge for hours, the survivors huddled in silence, the constant thump of MG-42 fire echoing through the fog. These were ordinary soldiers, clerks, mechanics, farmers who had marched from the beaches of Normandy to the threshold of Germany, only to find themselves trapped by a single nest of concrete and steel. And yet, amid that paralysis, one man, a corporal in his early 20s, began to think differently. He was no officer, no strategist, but what he saw wasn't hopelessness. It was opportunity, a chance to use the tools around him, to exploit confusion the same way the enemy used terrain. As the day wore on, his improvised idea took shape. A small act of wit, born from exhaustion and instinct, and that idea would soon alter the outcome of an entire sector of the front. The ridge where the small American unit lay pinned was one of hundreds along the Hürtgen line. It offered no cover, only shallow craters, shattered trees, and the thick fog that dulled the horizon. The enemy bunker sat on slightly higher ground, built into the slope with precision German engineers had perfected years earlier. Its design was simple, brutal, and effective. A narrow firing slit, reinforced doors, and an interior chamber connected to underground communication tunnels leading to nearby positions. The defenders could see everything, the attackers almost nothing. For the Americans, the bunker's presence was like a heartbeat in the fog. Constant, mechanical, unrelenting. Every few seconds, the MG-42 inside let loose a burst that scythed through the forest. The distinctive ripping sound, set to 200 rounds per minute, was impossible to ignore. Men instinctively flinched at its rhythm, even when the rounds weren't close. It was psychological warfare as much as firepower. By this stage of the campaign, every U.S. infantryman knew what those bunkers meant. Assaulting one usually required engineers, flamethrowers, or tanks. But in the dense forest, armor couldn't advance. Even artillery support was unpredictable. Tree bursts could kill friend and foe alike. The solution often fell to individual initiative. Soldiers adapting, improvising, and surviving through creativity rather than command orders. The corporal, who would soon change the course of this small fight, was part of Company E, 112th Infantry Regiment. His unit had been reduced to barely half strength. The previous night, a barrage had scattered the platoons and cut the field phone line. Their sergeant was wounded, the lieutenant missing. Leadership had dissolved into instinct. They'd spent the early morning trying to flank the bunker from the left, but the ground there was mined. One man crawled forward with a Bangalore torpedo. He didn't come back. Another tried to lob a grenade from behind a fallen pine trunk. It rolled back toward him. The group was running out of both options and courage. As the mist thickened again, the corporal began studying the rhythm of the gunfire. There was a pattern, a mechanical pause every 40 seconds, as the German gun crew changed barrels or reloaded ammunition belts. Between those bursts, there was silence, followed by muffled shouting from inside. That gap, he realized, was time. A few seconds of opportunity. Nearby lay the remnants of a destroyed German outpost. A spool of communication wire, a broken flare pistol, and an abandoned ration tin marked Heerespackung 1944. To most, it was debris. To him, it was material. He began collecting them quietly, his fingers numb from cold. He wasn't thinking in terms of tactics or heroism, only problem-solving. How to make a small sound seem like a big threat. How to force the enemy to surrender without ever seeing who was out there. The idea came from memory. Weeks earlier, during a briefing in Belgium, he'd seen engineers use dummy signals, flares and wire detonations to simulate large-scale attacks and draw fire away from real advances. He had watched and remembered. Now, with nothing left to lose, he began setting up his own illusion. He stripped a few yards of wire, attached the flare pistol to the ration tin, and rigged it to trigger remotely using a tension pull, a crude form of a trip device. If timed right, it would ignite the flare inside the tin, creating a contained explosion that sounded like a grenade detonation. And if he could fire several of them at once, in different spots, it might convince the Germans that a full assault was underway. From multiple directions. His squad mates watched silently, uncertain whether he'd gone mad or inspired. None spoke. They simply followed when he motioned for help. They crawled through the mud, placing the improvised charges in a semicircle around the bunker's entrance, careful to stay below the slope line. Every movement risked discovery. The forest grew eerily still. Even the MG-42 seemed to hesitate. The corporal tightened the final wire and waited for the next reload pause. He whispered a count under his breath. 3, 2, 1. The trap was set, and within minutes, the forest would erupt, not with bullets, but with sound and confusion that would turn the defenders' confidence into panic. In the Hürtgen, victory rarely belonged to strength. It belonged to endurance. Every soldier fought 2 wars at once, one against the enemy ahead, and another inside his own mind. Fatigue, cold, and uncertainty eroded courage faster than bullets ever could. By November 1944, the American infantryman was stretched to the edge of his will. What defined him wasn't always discipline or doctrine, it was adaptability, the ability to think when the world around him was collapsing. The corporal's improvised trick was born not from training manuals, but from desperation and observation. The American Army had taught initiative as an ideal, but in the mud of the Western Front, it was often a necessity of survival. When officers were gone, when radios failed, and when orders couldn't reach the line, command devolved to the man closest to the problem, the one still thinking clearly enough to solve it. That was the essence of the American soldier's character. Not just bravery, but resourcefulness under pressure. U.S. infantry units were filled with men who had been mechanics, electricians, and farmers back home, people used to fixing things that broke. They could turn scrap metal into tools, crates into bridges, and, on that November morning, a ration tin into a weapon of illusion. The psychological landscape of that forest amplified everything. German soldiers, well-trained and disciplined, were haunted by the constant threat of Allied artillery and air power, even when none was present. They had come to expect that any local skirmish could precede overwhelming force. The mere suggestion of an assault, a flare, or an explosion in the fog could convince them that a larger attack was imminent. This was the weakness the corporal understood instinctively. Inside the bunker, the German crew would have been operating blind. They couldn't see more than a few meters ahead. They relied on sound, the crack of rifles, the thud of grenades, the rumble of tanks, to gauge what was happening outside. When that sound changed, when something unexpected echoed through the mist, instinct took over. Fear magnified every noise. What the corporal was creating then wasn't a weapon. It was a psychological event, a controlled deception that preyed on tension already stretched to breaking point. He wasn't alone in this kind of improvisation. Across the European front, American soldiers were quietly reshaping the nature of combat. They wired fake radios to confuse German intercepts, used captured vehicles for infiltration, and even mimicked enemy voices over field phones to mislead opposing units. These acts were small and local, rarely recorded, often forgotten, but collectively, they revealed a truth, that modern warfare was as much about perception as firepower. In the Hürtgen, where visibility was almost zero, the mind became the most potent battlefield. Soldiers fought ghosts, imagined ambushes, and flinched at phantom movements in the fog. Fear was contagious. One man's panic could spread through a squad in seconds, but so too could courage. When a single soldier acted decisively, with confidence and clarity, it could reset the balance entirely. That morning, crouched behind the ridge, the corporal's calmness spread like quiet authority. The others didn't know his full plan, but they trusted it because it was something. An idea, a movement forward, a sign that not all initiative had died in that frozen forest. And as they watched him prepare his improvised network of wires and tins, each man began to understand that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun. It was imagination under fire. The German defensive system the Americans faced in late 1944 was one of engineering precision and military foresight. The Siegfried line, built years before the war's turning point, consisted of over 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and tank obstacles, each reinforced with steel and concrete, and positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. No single strongpoint could be attacked in isolation. It was always covered by another. From a tactical perspective, each bunker functioned like a chess piece in a larger, deadly design. It wasn't meant to be invincible. It was meant to delay, confuse, and bleed the attacker. Inside, the German defenders had periscopes, pre-registered artillery maps, and a deep knowledge of the terrain. Their communications were wired through underground systems that allowed instant coordination between nearby positions, at least when those lines remained intact. For the Americans, breaking this defense was rarely about brute force. It was about exploiting disruption. Every time a bunker's communication was cut, its crew became isolated, relying solely on guesswork and sound. That isolation created fear, the sense that the next explosion might mean encirclement. The corporal's improvised deception directly targeted that vulnerability. By rigging multiple flare tins to ignite in sequence, he was effectively creating a false multi-point attack signature. When triggered, the explosions would echo across the ravine and bounce between tree trunks, creating the illusion of a larger force maneuvering through the fog. Technically, it was a primitive form of acoustic warfare. Later in the war, similar tactics would be formalized by specialized deception units like the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known as the Ghost Army. They used recorded sounds, inflatable tanks, and pyrotechnics to mislead German intelligence. But in the Hürtgen, months before such operations became doctrine, this corporal had stumbled upon the same principle on his own. The simplicity of his setup belied its tactical brilliance. The wire spool allowed him to trigger the devices from a distance, ensuring the explosions appeared scattered. One to the left, two behind the bunker, another to the right. The timing was crucial, each blast spaced just far enough apart to simulate advancing squads. To an observer inside, it would sound like multiple platoons closing in from several directions at once. German defensive training had instilled a clear protocol. When facing what appeared to be encirclement, defenders were to destroy sensitive documents, disable communications, and, if cut off, surrender only when resistance was hopeless. But in the Hürtgen, communication lines were already unreliable. Once confusion set in, panic followed. The Americans didn't have to storm the bunker. They had to make its crew believe they were already surrounded. Tactically, this deception did more than capture a single position. It demonstrated the shifting nature of late-war combat. The once dominant Wehrmacht, trained for mobility and offensive action, was now confined to static defense. Against such rigidity, adaptability became the Allies' greatest advantage. American troops, supported by an industrial machine that could improvise faster than Germany could repair, reflected this philosophy at every level, from generals coordinating massive logistics networks to a corporal wiring together a few scraps in the mud. Both were acts of engineering genius born from necessity. What happened next would prove how far improvisation could reach. How, even amid chaos and exhaustion, one well-timed illusion could unravel a fortress built for eternity. The moment of action was near. The wire was ready. The bunker crew, unaware, prepared for another reload. And in that narrow space between calm and catastrophe, the corporal would pull the line that changed everything. The forest was silent, except for the faint hiss of mist sliding between the trees. It was the kind of silence that never lasted long in war. Too complete, too expectant. The corporal lay flat against the cold earth, his gloves soaked through with mud. Beside him, two men waited, one clutching his rifle, the other gripping a grenade that had long since frozen to his palm. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Every breath was timed to the rhythm of the enemy's gunfire ahead. Through the fog, the bunker's firing slit flashed, short. Controlled bursts of MG-42 fire raked the ridge, just high enough to keep the Americans pinned. But the corporal had counted. He knew the pattern now. The reload pause that came like a heartbeat. 40 seconds on, 10 seconds off. That was his window. He lifted his head just enough to glimpse the bunker outline, a gray shape against gray light. The machine gun barked again, stopped, then silence. The corporal inhaled once, deep and deliberate. His fingers found the trigger wire. He tugged. The first flare ignited with a metallic hiss, exploding inside the ration tin with a flash of blinding red. The sound was sharp, sharper than a grenade, but hollow, echoing strangely in the fog. It bounced between the trees, magnified by the still air. Then a second blast, farther to the left. Then another behind the bunker. Each came seconds apart, spreading like footsteps through the forest. To the Americans crouched behind the ridge, the effect was immediate. It felt like movement everywhere, like something larger had arrived. But inside the bunker, the confusion was total. Through the narrow firing slit, the German crew saw flashes from 3 directions. The sound of burning flares mimicked the hiss of fuses. To men already expecting an American assault, it sounded like a ring of grenades primed to detonate. The gunner froze mid-reload. Someone shouted, "Achtung! Angriff! Attack!" Another explosion, a flare ricocheting off a tree, sent sparks across the bunker's entrance. The crew chief tried to call neighboring positions, but the field phone line had been severed days earlier. The silence on the line confirmed their worst fear. They were alone. Outside, the corporal triggered the final tin. It went off closer than intended. The concussion shook dirt from his helmet. But that was the finishing touch. Now the illusion was perfect. Inside the bunker, panic took hold. The Germans believed they were surrounded. Without visual contact or communication, they interpreted the flares as grenades and satchel charges thrown toward their firing ports. The youngest among them bolted for the rear door. Another shouted for smoke grenades to cover retreat. The commander hesitated only a moment before deciding to abandon the position. Then it happened. The creak of the heavy steel door swinging open. The corporal didn't move. He simply gestured to his men to wait. Moments later, 3 figures emerged, coughing through the mist, their helmets and tunics dusted with concrete. They raised their hands instinctively. Weapons slung behind them, eyes wide and searching for attackers that didn't exist. From the ridge, the Americans rose like ghosts from the mud. Rifles trained, but fingers steady. No shots fired, no shouts. Just the sound of boots crunching through frost and disbelief spreading across both sides. The impossible had happened. A German bunker, untouched by shell fire, captured without a single bullet. And in that frozen silence, amid the echoes of phantom explosions, the corporal lowered his head and finally exhaled. The surrender itself happened quietly, almost absurdly so. 3 German soldiers emerged first, then 2 more, followed by a final man dragging a bandaged leg. Each stepped cautiously into the open, rifles dangling, hands raised high in surrender. Their eyes darted around the fog, expecting to see dozens of Americans encircling them. Instead, they saw only a handful. 7 men, drenched, exhausted, and half buried in mud. The German sergeant froze, realizing too late what had happened. His expression flickered from confusion to disbelief, then to resignation. He dropped his weapon first. The others followed, one after another, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. The corporal stepped forward slowly, his rifle slung but ready. He gestured toward the ground, signaling them to sit. None resisted. They obeyed with the quiet dignity of soldiers who understood the rules of war. Defeated, but alive. Inside the bunker, the Americans discovered what the enemy had left behind: belts of 7.90 20mm ammunition, spare barrels for the MG-42, and unopened rations stacked neatly along the wall. The room smelled of oil, gunpowder, and fear. On a wooden table lay a field map, creased and marked with pencil, showing not just their own position, but a web of nearby fortifications along the ridge. The corporal picked it up and stared at the precise network of coordinates, each bunker connected by wire, each line labeled. It wasn't just a victory, it was intelligence, a glimpse into the design of Germany's entire local defense. Within minutes, word spread down the line. Other squads, still pinned in the forest, saw the white cloth waving above the bunker and realized something extraordinary had occurred. A radio operator, finally getting a signal, relayed the message to battalion command. Enemy position neutralized. No casualties. Objective secured. The disbelief on the other end was immediate. Bunkers didn't fall without artillery. They didn't surrender without blood. Yet here it was. Confirmed, verified, and impossible. As the corporal's squad took turns standing guard, the forest began to awaken again. Distant artillery echoed somewhere to the north. Snow began to fall in thin, slow flakes, resting on the helmets of men who hadn't moved in hours. One soldier laughed quietly, the first sound of relief any of them had heard in days. They offered the Germans water and a cigarette, small gestures of humanity amid the exhaustion. The young corporal said little. He sat outside the bunker's entrance, hands trembling not from fear now, but from the release of it. What he'd done hadn't felt heroic. It had felt necessary. For him, it wasn't about outsmarting the enemy. It was about surviving a fight that no one could win head-on. His trick hadn't come from genius. It had come from understanding the simple truth that war was as much about perception as firepower. Hours later, as reinforcements arrived and the prisoners were escorted to the rear, the company commander demanded to know how the position had been taken. The corporal explained in plain terms, no dramatics, no claims of brilliance, just a few flares, some wire, and a bit of timing. The officer stared at him, then shook his head slowly. "You took a bunker," he said quietly, "with scrap metal and nerve." The report written that evening was brief. It listed the action as enemy fortification captured by deception. No rounds expended. It would never make headlines, nor reach the history books. But among the men who witnessed it, the story would spread, retold in tents and foxholes, a moment of ingenuity amid a forest of futility. And while countless battles still raged along the Siegfried line, this one small act stood apart. Proof that sometimes, in a war measured by firepower, victory could come from silence. When the sun finally broke through the fog that afternoon, the Hürtgen Forest revealed its scars. Smoke curled from shattered treetops. The ground churned into a graveyard of splintered roots and rusted metal. The 28th Infantry Division had advanced barely half a mile in 3 days. Yet even that was considered success. Word of the silent bunker capture reached battalion headquarters by dusk. The report, scribbled hastily on damp paper, was passed from officer to officer. Few believed it at first. In a campaign where each foot of ground was paid for in blood, a victory without casualties seemed almost mythic. But verification came swiftly. Photographs, prisoners, and captured maps all confirmed the impossible. The corporal's name appeared briefly in the daily situation log. just another entry among hundreds. There was no medal ceremony, no photograph, no parade. In the chaos of the Hürtgen campaign, quiet victories often vanished beneath the roar of larger battles. Yet, among those who survived that forest, his act became something else entirely. A symbol of what American soldiers had learned through relentless adaptation. By late November, U.S. forces were still grinding forward against the Siegfried Line's concrete teeth. Every bunker was a fortress, every ravine a killing ground. German engineers had built the line to withstand tanks, artillery, even time itself. But it wasn't built to withstand creativity, the ability of a single soldier to turn scraps into strategy. Military analysts later studied these moments, not as grand tactics, but as examples of battlefield improvisation that defined the American style of war. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of their enemies, U.S. troops were encouraged to act, to decide, to improvise. From Normandy hedgerows to the Philippine jungles, this instinct became a weapon in itself. In the weeks after the bunker incident, patrols along the forest edge began using decoys and noise tactics inspired by the corporal's approach. Units strung empty ration tins on tripwire, mimicked armor engines with sound boxes, and used captured German flares to create false troop movements. Reports from German prisoners revealed confusion. They described phantom battalions. Entire companies, they believed, surrounded them, when in truth, only a handful of Americans advanced. The corporal's squad was reassigned to a rest area near Stolberg in December. They spent their days cleaning weapons, sleeping through artillery thunder, and repairing torn uniforms. For them, the war was far from over. The Battle of the Bulge loomed only weeks away. But that brief episode in the forest had left a mark. They joked about it sometimes, calling it the quietest victory in Europe. But in their eyes lingered something deeper. The knowledge that they had survived not through strength alone, but through wit. For the corporal himself, letters home spoke little of what happened. He wrote only that they found a way through without much trouble. His modesty reflected a generation's mindset. Men who saw heroism not in glory, but in endurance. Back at division headquarters, intelligence officers pored over the captured German map. The coordinates led to several more bunkers, each part of a defensive grid hidden within the forest. Within days, artillery targeted those sites, softening the line for future assaults. Thus, a trick born of desperation became part of a broader strategy, one that allowed U.S. forces to finally breach the forest's edge and push toward the Roer River. It was a small thread in a vast tapestry of war. But history, as always, was shaped as much by small threads as by grand battles. By early December 1944, the Hürtgen campaign was drawing to its grim conclusion. The American advance had cost more than 30,000 casualties, a brutal price for a few square miles of forest. Yet in those bitter lessons, commanders began to recognize something that would echo through the rest of the war. Victory in Europe would not belong to the strongest army, but to the most adaptable one. At regimental briefings, officers began emphasizing initiative, urging platoon leaders and enlisted men alike to act without waiting for orders. The Army called it mission-type thinking, a philosophy borrowed from the Germans themselves, but perfected by the Americans in practice. It was this same mindset, the one that allowed a single corporal to outthink a bunker, that now became doctrine across the front. When historians later traced the evolution of American tactics in late 1944, they noted that small, localized acts of ingenuity often preceded major operational breakthroughs. Whether it was engineers improvising bridge repairs under fire, medics converting tank fuel pumps into blood transfusion devices, or soldiers using captured enemy telephones to relay false coordinates, these small adaptations defined how the U.S. Army learned and survived. In the case of the silent bunker, the intelligence gathered from that single event rippled outward. The maps seized that morning exposed the lateral communication trenches linking multiple defensive nests. Within 2 weeks, coordinated artillery fire based on those coordinates neutralized 5 additional strongpoints. Each fell with minimal resistance, not because the enemy lacked courage, but because they'd been deceived, disrupted, and disoriented long before the assault came. German reports recovered after the war confirmed their confusion. One field diary from a lieutenant in the 353rd Infantry Division read, "We believed a large American assault was imminent. The flares, the shouts, the rumbling. We expected tanks. We had no idea we faced only a few men. They made us surrender our own fortress to shadows." It was a haunting admission, not of cowardice, but of the psychological weight of war. The bunker wasn't just captured physically, it was conquered in the mind first. After the war, the corporal returned home to Ohio. He worked as a mechanic, married, raised children. For years, his unit's story remained buried among countless others. When asked about it decades later, he only shrugged and said, "We were just tired of dying in that forest." Yet his improvised trick, a combination of nerve, timing, and imagination, quietly embodied the essence of American warfare in the 20th century. Resourcefulness under pressure, courage without spectacle, and a belief that intellect could win where brute force failed. Military academies would later cite similar acts as case studies in battlefield psychology. The U.S. Army's post-war manuals began emphasizing deception, terrain usage, and creative initiative as official training doctrines, turning what was once instinct into institution. In that sense, the corporal's trick didn't just save his squad. It reshaped thinking at the very foundation of modern combat. The Hürtgen Forest today is quiet. Moss covers the shattered bunkers. Rusted helmets lie half-buried under leaves. Tourists walk its trails unaware that, beneath their feet, the ghosts of soldiers, both American and German, rest side by side. Yet somewhere in those woods, under layers of earth and silence, lies the memory of a moment when war paused, not for mercy, but for ingenuity. A battle won without a bullet fired. War remembers its thunder, the guns, the fire, the names etched into monuments, but history often forgets the quiet moments, the brief instances when human ingenuity outshined destruction. In the great machinery of World War II, where industry and firepower decided nations' fates, it's easy to overlook the single mind that dared to think differently. The corporal's act in the Hürtgen Forest was not one of defiance, but of understanding. That even in chaos, intelligence remained a soldier's most powerful weapon. His trick didn't change the war. It didn't alter the maps or halt the storms to come, but it proved something deeper, that even amid the cruelty of mechanized war, the essence of human creativity survived. It whispered that victory, at its core, was never just about weapons or numbers, but about how one man could use the smallest fragment of opportunity to turn the impossible into survival. For the Germans, it was another bewildering moment, a testament to the Americans' uncanny ability to adapt. For the Americans, it was a quiet reminder that courage didn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply thought, the war would rage on. More forests would burn, more cities fall. But long after the thunder faded, that morning in the mist would remain. When one soldier, armed with nothing but instinct and imagination, showed that even silence could be stronger than fire. A single trick, a single bunker, and a lesson that would outlast the war itself.